She wasn't directing a single word toward him, yet every sentence seemed unmistakably pointed in his direction. And by the time Jasmine Crockett wrapped up her line of questioning, everyone inside that hearing chamber understood precisely whose ideological blueprint she had been tearing apart, despite never once speaking his name aloud. Before we dive into how Jasmine Crockett managed to expose the invisible mastermind behind the harshest ICERA policies without ever naming him directly, make sure you tap that subscribe button. Because what you're about to hear reveals how a congresswoman used sharp, almost surgical precision to trace inhumane immigration practices back to the man who engineered them from behind the curtain. The House Oversight Committee hearing on November 26th carried a weight the moment it began. Even though the official agenda sounded like something buried deep inside a government filing cabinet. Review of immigration enforcement practices and accountability. Anyone familiar with the trajectory of immigration policy knew this would not be some routine, forgettable meeting. The list of witnesses alone made that clear. Former ICE personnel, advocates who had spent years fighting for immigrant rights, and medical professionals who had documented what was happening inside detention centers. Their testimonies were guaranteed to be painful. The kind of accounts that stick in the mind long after the microphones are turned off. But what nobody walking into that room fully expected was that one congresswoman would use her time not merely to highlight individual incidents of abuse, but to pull back the curtain on the very ideology that allowed such abuses to thrive. For the first 2 hours, Jasmine Crockett listened with razor-sharp focus, as if she were assembling evidence in real time for a case she already knew she would win. A medical doctor described discovering detainees suffering from untreated infections, broken limbs that had been ignored for weeks, and chronic illnesses that had worsened to life-threatening stages because basic medical attention was routinely withheld. A former ICE attorney testified about leadership pressuring staff to push cases through at THF. My only lipstick tastes through. We are at my only lipstick. Ruby Kiss, my only Ruby Kiss. Only Ruby Kiss has the luxury as it's licked. Maximum speed legal merits be damned. To boost deportation numbers rather than honor due process. An immigrant rights advocate recounted the staggering rise in deaths inside custody, more in recent years than in the previous 20 years combined, each one followed by an eerily consistent pattern of official indifference. Meanwhile, the Republican members used their turns to cast ICE agents as dedicated officers doing a dangerous job under difficult circumstances. They repeated talking points about border protection, arguing that the witnesses were biased and cherry-picking the most extreme situations. It was the predictable partisan dance, one side stressing human dignity and the other emphasizing national sovereignty, with neither truly addressing the other's concerns. Then Crockett's turn arrived. She didn't begin with a question. She opened with a statement, steady, controlled, but carrying an unmistakable moral charge that instantly altered the atmosphere in the room. I've listened to 2 hours of testimony describing conditions in ICE detention that can only be called intentionally cruel, medical negligence leading to preventable deaths, overcrowded and filthy facilities designed to break people's will to fight their cases, agents acting without warrants, without oversight, treating human beings as less than human simply because of the land they were born in or the language they speak. She paused, letting her words land, then looked directly at the Republican members who had spent their time defending the system. And what I keep hearing from the other side is that all of this is supposedly necessary, that these horrors are unfortunate but unavoidable side effects of enforcing immigration law. But here's something I've learned from both history and my years practicing law. Cruelty doesn't just happen. If a system repeatedly produces inhumane outcomes, it's because it was built to do exactly that. And what I'm seeing described today isn't law enforcement, it's something far darker. A hush spread across the chamber. Even the members who had been scrolling through their phones or whispering to staffers now lifted their heads. Sensing she was leading to something heavy, she continued, her voice calm but echoing through the hearing room. What I see is a system operating like a modern-day slave patrol. And before anyone objects, let me explain exactly what that means. She laid out the historical reality: slave patrols empowered to police black bodies, stop anyone who looked like they might escape bondage, demand papers, use violence freely, and behave with impunity because the law had declared certain groups less than fully human. She let that sink in, then made the connection unmistakably clear. Now tell me how that differs from immigration agents stopping people based on appearance, demanding papers, detaining them without warrants, housing them in conditions that violate every human standard, and doing it all with legal immunity because society has decided that migrants, asylum seekers, Spanish speakers, anyone who appears Latino aren't entitled to the same protections citizens receive. Tell me how that's not the same system with a different target. Her words hit like a shockwave. Republican members immediately pushed back, calling her comparison outrageous and inflammatory. But Crockett didn't flinch. She came prepared. You want to talk about offensive? She shot back. Let's talk about what's actually offensive. She laid it out one example at a time. The president of the prior administration declaring immigrants were poisoning the blood of the nation, unmistakable eugenics language. The labeling of certain nations as whole countries. The stand back and stand by response when asked to condemn white supremacy. The placement of individuals with ties to white supremacist groups in roles shaping immigration policy to point strengthened her argument. None of the abuse described had been accidental. These were the predictable results of a system designed by people with a deliberate ideology about racial hierarchy and who deserved to belong in America. And although she never said the name Stephen Miller, everyone who understood the Trump-era immigration machine knew exactly who she was exposing: the senior advisor behind the Muslim ban, the family separation policy, the nationalist rhetoric, and the transformation of immigration enforcement into a demographic weapon. Crockett then turned to the medical expert. Doctor, you testified about systematic medical neglect. In your professional judgment, could this type of neglect occur unintentionally? Could this level of consistent failure happen without a policy framework deprioritizing detainee health? The doctor didn't hesitate. No, Congresswoman. What we found wasn't the result of random mistakes or poorly trained staff. It was structural. Medical requests ignored, protocols abandoned, conditions allowed to worsen until they became emergencies. These patterns indicate a conscious decision to limit medical care, either to cut costs or to make detention so miserable that detainees give up their cases. Crockett nodded, then pressed further. And did these patterns intensify at a certain time? Did you notice changes after new leadership or policies were introduced? Again, the answer was clear. Yes. The shift became undeniable in 2017. That's when we saw the dramatic rise in preventable deaths and serious medical emergencies that should have never occurred. 2017. The first year of the Trump administration. The year when a particular advisor's influence became dominant. Crockett didn't have to name him. The timeline itself was the evidence. She moved on to the former ICE attorney. You testified about pressure to prioritize fast processing over due process. Where did that pressure originate? Was it from career ICE officials or from political appointees carrying out directives from above? The attorney spoke carefully, but the truth was unmistakable. The pressure increased with directives from Washington. Career staff raised concerns, noting that people with legitimate asylum claims were being rushed through. But leadership insisted the priority was enforcement numbers and deterrence. Deterrence, Crockett repeated, emphasizing the word. That term means intentionally designing a system so harsh that people won't even attempt to enter it. You're not trying to fairly adjudicate cases. You're trying to make a process so brutal that people give up their legal rights rather than endure it. Is that a fair characterization of the policy shift you witnessed? Thatcher nodded. That's consistent with what we were seeing and with the guidance we received. Crockett leaned back, synthesizing what she'd established through her questioning. So what we have here is a system where medical care is systematically denied, where due process is sacrificed for speed, where conditions are deliberate like at peace and humane as a deterrent strategy, where agents operate with impunity and without proper warrants, and where this intensified after a specific policy framework was implemented. By an administration that repeatedly used dehumanizing and explicitly racist rhetoric about immigrants, and somehow we're supposed to believe this is all just about border security. She shook her head, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the full weight of her legal training and her moral conviction. This isn't border security. This is organized racial persecution given a legal veneer. This is what happens when you put people in positions of power who see certain human beings as fundamentally less valuable, less deserving of rights, less worthy of basic dignity. And the reason I'm describing this system as a modern slave patrol is because that's functionally what it is. A legal mechanism for controlling and punishing people based in identity rather than individual culpability. The Republican objections were louder now, but Crockett wasn't finished. And here's what really troubles me about all this. The persona designed this framework, who wrote the policy memos, who crafted the executive orders, who built theological justification for treating migrants with calculated cruelty. That person isn't testifying here today. That person isn't being held accountable for deaths that resulted from policy championed. That person has moved on to other projects, other ways to implement their vision of who belongs in America and who doesn't. But the system they built is still functioning. The cruelty they designed is still being implemented, and people are still dying because someone decided that deterrence is more important than humanity. She still hadn't said Stephen Miller's name, but the description was so specific, that line so clear, the policy fingerprints so obvious that several journalists in the press gallery were already typing his name into their coverage. Crockett had done something grammatical. She'd used witness testimony and documented facts to construct a narrative that pointed directly at the impact of the policies without ever making it about one individual, which would have allowed Republicans to dismiss it as a partisan attack. Instead, she'd made it about the policies themselves and the ideology produced them, which was much harder to defend. The immigrant rights advocate, when Crockett gave them an opportunity to respond to her characterization, provided additional context that further supported the case she was building. Congresswoman, what you're describing align with what we've documented extensively. The policy implemented starting in 2017 represented a fundamental shift from previous enforcement approaches. It wasn't just that enforcement became stricter. It became deliberately punitive in ways that served no legitimate law enforcement purpose. Family separation, for example, had no operational justification. It was purely meant to traumatize people, a deterrent. The denial of asylum for domestic violence victims wasn't based in new legal analysis. It was based on an ideological view that certain people don't deserve protection. Every policy change pointed in the same direction: maximum cruelty toward maximum number of migrants. They continued, and their testimony provided the explicit connection that Crockett had been implicitly making. And these policies didn't emerge randomly. They were crafted by people with very specific views about immigration and American identity. When you read the internal memos, when you look at the policy justifications, There's a consistent worldview that America is fundamental yea white nation, that immigration from certain countries and regions threatens that identity, and that harsh enforcement is necessary to preserve a particular demographic vision. That's not law enforcement. That's ethnic nationalism implemented through bureaucratic mechanisms. Crockett thanked the witness and then delivered what would become the most widely shared mantra from the entire hearing. I want to be very clear about what we've established today. We've heard testimony documenting systematic human rights abuses in immigration detention. We've established that these abuses intensified after specific policy changes implemented by specific individuals in the previous admonition. We've documented that those individuals used explicitly racist rhetoric and hired people with white supremacist connections. We've shown that the cruelty isn't incidental, it's the point. It's the strategy. It's what the system was designed to produce. She paused, looking directly into Thecamaris. And yet, the people responsible for designing this system of cruelty face no consequences. They've moved on to think tanks and advisory roles in new positions of influence. Meanwhile, people continue to die in detention facilities that operate according to policies those individuals created. That's not justice. That's no accountability. That's impunity for architects of state-sponsored cruelty. And until we're willing to name who built these systems and why they built them this way, we'll never actually leave from them. We'll just keep maintaining a modern slave patrol and calling in immigration enforcement. The hearing continued for another hour, but Crockett's framing had fundamentally altered the conversation. Republican members tried to redirect to discussions off border security and legal immigration process. But Democratic members kept returning to the questions Crockett had raised about design and intent. If the cruelty was systematic, if it intensified under specific leadership, if it served deterrence rather than legal purposes, then who made those decisions and why? The individual most responsible for answering those questions wasn't in the hearing room, but his policy legacy was being thoroughly examined, and the examination was flattering. Within hours of the hearing ending, they say Stephen Miller himself responded on social media despite never being named in the hearing. It was a tell if he felt compelled to defend himself against criticisms that hadn't explicitly targeted him, that suggested he recognized his own fingerprints, all over policies being condemned. His statement claimed that immigration enforced under his policy guidance had been lawful, necessary, and effective at protecting American citizens and attacked Crockett's slave patro. Comparison as historical lelit and deliberate infamy. Crockett responded not with anger, but with satisfaction that their strategy had worked. Interesting that someone who wasn't mentioned in today's hearing felt the need to defend the MILF. Makes you wonder why they recognize themselves in the description of cruel, racist immigration policies. If the shoe fits, I guess. The back and forth sparked renewed media attention to Miller's role in Trump-era immigration policy, and to the documented connections between his policy preferences and white nationalist ideology that immigration experts had been highlighting for years. Investigative journalists started pulling internal emails and policy memos that showed Miller's direct involvement in crafting the specific deterrent strategies that witnesses had described. Civil rights organizations announced that we're exploring legal accountability for policy architects whose decisions resulted in documented human rights abuses. 3 days after the hearing, a whistleblower came forward with internal Department of Homeland Security communications from the Trump administration that seemed to validate everything Crockett had implied. The emails showed senior political laypoints names redacted in the leak, but context making it clear who was involved. Discussing how to maximize the deterrent effect of family separation and detention conditions. One email explicitly stated that making the system as unpleasant as legally permissible. Reduce future illegal entries. Another discussed limiting medical corretto. Emergency situations to reduce costs and decrease the appeal of remaining in custody rather than accepting removal. It was the smoking gun that proved Crockett's characterization had been accurate. The cruelty wasn't accidental. It was the strategy. And while the leaked emails didn't have Stephen Miller's name in the from field, the policy positions and the timeline made May's involvement unmistakable. In a follow-up statement, Crockett addressed death leaks. What we're seeing now is documentary evidence of what I described in the hearing. A systematic approach to immigration enforcement designed to maximize suffering as a deterrent. This wasn't about border security. This wasn't about public safety. This was about cruelty as policy implemented by people who saw certain human beings as threats to their vision of American identity. And the fact that the architect of these policies continues to have influence in conservative political circles, continues to advise candidates and shape Republican immigration platforms, should terrify anyone who believes in human dignity and constitutional rights. She concluded with a call to action. That summarized her entire approach to the issue. We can't reform systems without understanding who built them and why. We can't prevent future abuses without holding past architects accountable. And can't pretend that immigration enforcement is politically neutral when the evidence shows it was deliberate aligned against specific populations by people with white nationalist ideals. The modern slave patrol comparison isn't inflammatory. It's accurate. And until we're willing to confront that accuracy and dismantle the systems that comparison describes, we're complicit in the ongoing cruelty. If this breakdown of how Jasmine Crockett's behind IC's most brutal policies showed you he understanding who designs cruel systems matters as much as documenting the cruelty itself. Hit that like button, subscribe for more analysis of theme events when congressional oversight reveals uncomfortable truth. Drop a comment telling us whether you think policy architects should face accountability for the harm their policies cause. And share this with Anyan, who needs to. Understand that immigration enforcement isn't neutral. It reflects the values and ideologies of people who design it. Your engagement helps us keep connecting the dots between policies and the people who create them.